Our second presenter is Colin Takeo. The title of his paper is The People's Music, Rhetoric, and Musical Symbolism in the German Democratic Republic's 1954 Musikfest des... I'm not going to say it right. I don't have German. How would you say it?
Musikfest des Vaterka. So, we see here a poster commemorating the 1st of May, 1953. So the Labor's International Day, May Day, which occurred earlier this month, actually, and which you'll find conspicuously we don't celebrate in the United States. But this poster was set to commemorate the day in East Germany. And you'll see that the kind of theme of the poster is social unity. But little did cultural officials know that just over a month later, the streets of East Germany would look like this. Thousands upon thousands of workers took to the streets protesting new labor laws and protesting forced collectivization, as well as limited democratic freedoms. The only way that cultural officials, as well as the government, were able to quell the Fuhrer was to put Soviet tanks and Soviet soldiers on the ground. Unfortunately, this only pushed the issues back into people's homes. The issues still existed within society. So cultural officials and government politicians had to decide how they were going to repair their society. How would they get back to this? The socialist ideal of people working together under the socialist flag with their various nationalities, but working together in the socialist struggle. Thankfully, in East Germany, cultural infrastructure, despite World War II, had been heavily fortified in the following years after the war. So cultural officials maintained a cultural hardline and continued supporting cultural events such as music festivals, which we'll be looking at, and they supported an aesthetic known as socialist realism, which we see displayed here, and they spent lots of resources on soft control, so music, art, and so on, as opposed to hard control, tanks and guns out on the street. And as I said, Musikfest was part of these efforts. So there was an extensive music selection process associated with Musikfest des Vaterka. The event was to be held in 1954 in October, so just over a year after the uprising in 1953. And there would be two central committees that would choose and handpick which pieces were to be performed at the concert. So one of those central committees was government officials themselves. They got together and they came up with criteria that each piece would satisfy, and then they sent this criteria off to a composers union pictured here that included composers and musicologists. And this group then formed the exact list that would appear at Musikfest des Vaterka. So the works were heavily controlled, and they were supposed to fit within this cultural hardline, within this ideology of East Germany. So what works did they choose? So we see here actually the original program. I took this picture in the Leipzig National Library where I did my research. And so we see here are the four pieces. And we're going to take a listen to the first one on there, which is titled Suite aus der Oper Persische Episode, which is a selection from an opera. And then we're going to take another look at The fourth piece listed, which is Sinfonia 2 by Ottmar Gerster. So what should strike you off the bat is these pieces themselves don't particularly sound socialist. If they were played out on the street or played at a concert today without any sort of text to explain what they were, they could be mistaken for a piece from basically any composer. So how did these pieces come to embody socialist ideals or German ideals, and what exactly were those? And the way that they gained those properties was through the program itself. So the text in the program offered audience members the interpretations that they needed to understand that these musical pieces were socialist, were German, and would help with social repair. The program itself had to bill Musikfest and its pieces showcased as the culmination of great Germanic and socialist culture, a culture that would reinvigorate the people in their revolutionary struggle. So what were some of these specific signs? We have openness and repair after rupture. So Ottmar Gerster, who wrote part of the program, hoped that the music would, quote, work with the realization of our communal aim and would speak a language understood by all. He then mentioned how he hoped the event would mirror Bach, who, despite living in a, quote, time of deep national humiliation and splintering, composed highly spirited works, and that this music specifically would break down the concern-fulfilling forces of destruction and alienation in our fatherland. So this idea of music being open to the people and uniting the people. Then, with Wagner Regini's piece, that suite from the opera, the program explained that the piece had, quote, jazz elements throughout that embodied frivolities and love for purchasable goods. I don't know how a musical piece does that, but that's what the program claimed. And then it titled the various sections of the work. So the section of the work that we heard was Music of the Great Sharks. And the great sharks were explained to be businessmen and gentlemen in evening wear. And explained that the work was brutal and jazzy with uncomfortable motives that contrasted against a viciously agitated melody. So seemingly the program left little musical symbolism up to interpretation. And with Ottmar Gerster's piece, that more mild-mannered symphony that we heard, he discussed in his blurb about his piece that the work was inspired by the Thuringian landscape, which is a very culturally significant region of Germany. And he saw the region as a, quote, land pulsing with life, the liveliest presence, and the greatest, specifically for a typical German past. And his work was part of a, quote, indivisible German culture. So this idea, once again, of unity coming through music and coming through national signs was extremely important. Finally, he talked about various cultural figures in Germany. He mentioned Luther, Bach, and Goethe, and how they inspired his piece, and how these cultural figures, while dead, were still campaigning and struggling and working for the progress of people in Thuringia to that day. So we see that Luther, Goethe, and Bach became comrades in the socialist struggle. So in the end, we see all these national signs tied to the music in order to take the prowess and apply it to a socialist context. Effectively, composers wish to co-opt these signs, whether they were national or socialist, and their power, and use it in the socialist struggle. We see here a construction of a signifying system.
Thank you. So questions for Colin?
Yeah.
So Colin, if I was a German person
Uh-huh.
and I heard this song, would it mean something to me?
It's possible. It depends on how old you are, whether you lived in East or West. If you lived through the Cold War, it would most likely mean something to you. But of course, if you live in East Germany, it might have more positive connotations than if you lived in West. Although the music festival itself actually didn't go over very well. So apparently something like half of the crowd left during intermission. And most of the people disliked the works. So, yeah. Which I discuss in my paper, why that would occur.
Other questions? Have the pieces been continued to be judged poorly like that?
Yes, they actually have. They're not really performed that often because they carry a lot of cultural baggage, so to speak. And actually, part of the reason I got into this project is I was looking for this music, and I saw an Amazon review, of all things, that was talking about Ottmar Gerster and how he was like this snake and evil because he wrote not only for East Germany under the socialist regime, but also for the Third Reich. So it carries a lot of tension even to this day. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions, and one is, were the pieces specifically composed for the Musikfest? And the other question is, how did the organizers get the audience members to read the program notes that were driving this whole social agenda?
Certainly.
Yeah.
So not all of the pieces were composed specifically for the event. So notably, Ottmar Gerster's piece was composed in 1951, actually during the heaviest period of cultural domination in East Germany. And I believe the other pieces, all of them, were composed before for different events. And how did they make sure that people read them? That is a really good question. Obviously, cultural domination in East Germany was not to the point where they actually forced people to read it. And so this is kind of what I talk about in the reason for why this event failed, possibly, is because the interpretation offered by the program actually didn't end up mattering as much to people as the emotional connection that they made with the piece on stage. So it shows this kind of disconnection, though, between the cultural organizers and their expectations about what people do with these interpretations offered by the program. Yeah.
Final question for Colin?
Was the Forum of Composers part of the socialist regime, or were they maybe against it?
Oh, this
Yes,
union?
The composers that they sent the regulations to.
So the composers and their music, as I said, they were checked out by these two separate committees, and the composers union itself was both officially overseen by the central government and also spied on by the central government. They vetted the biography of all of these composers and made sure that they were true socialists. So, whether or not they actually believed in what they were doing is up for interpretation, but people were fairly certain that they were.
Please join me in thanking Colin.